Alright, we're back for another one of these, but before we launch into the main event, we are going to take a quick glance at this game, not because of the game itself, but because it shows what team I'm using. It's a team I originally built for my buddy Brofist to use in SPL 4 years ago, and it's actually a team I'm pretty proud of because it was a new spin on an established style, and since its appearance, it has gone on to be used by a bunch of other players, and it's nowadays, as a result, a fairly established, recognizable set of reliable six Pokemon. So I'm happy about that. It's a Magneton Claydol team, or MagDal, because the idea with MagDal is Skarmory is just such a pain, because if you forcibly remove it with Magneton, it still leaves its spikes behind, and those are just the worst. And if you try and go the rapid spin route, then Skarmory will famously outlast you. So by combining the two of them together, then you just remove Skarm and the pressure it leaves behind. Great, right? So before this, Magdal teams were pretty much all going in on Curse Rest Snorlax, and sometimes Calm Mind Rest Suicune as well, but it was always about the lax. It was always about clearing the weather. As well, they would throw in things like Rain Dance Zapdos, and just completely removing the sand spikes that would prevent Snorlax from sweeping. And it was all about just because most teams wouldn't beat Snorlax through having a hard counter to it. They would beat it just by forcing it to rest and taking advantage of how slow and easy to force to rest it was. Because in sand, even little hits stick really hard. Even one switch into a layer of spikes, 12.5, that's significant. Or one leech seed, for example, that's big. In sand and spikes, then Snorlax is very, very difficult to get going. And outside of sand and spikes, then it's obviously much more threatening. The similar tactics apply to Calm Mind Rest Suicune, but the thing with Magdal teams is that you have a lot of Pokemon to cover defensively. So a lot of those teams wouldn't go with the second boosting sweeper so much as they would do everything possible to support the Snorlax. So the problem I had with those teams, the ones that went all in on Snorlax and the ones that went with both Lax and Suicune, is that they fished really, really hard for the Skarmory matchup. And they were just so utterly ruined by other very common team styles. I thought it was a very strong overreaction to fighting Skarmory, because these teams were so engineered to automatically win against standard Skarmory sand styles. As much as you can, obviously. To any extent. There were still instances of guys like Asamatitos playing around such matchups. But the general idea was doing everything possible to just completely strangle any sorts of pressure they had and to try and auto-win that matchup as much as you could. The problem is that by doing that, you sacrificed your matchups against other things. Things like Heracross and offensive Calm Mind Sweepers were just utterly ruinous. So that I never cared for those. I thought they were just taking all the gameplay out of the game, and it was pretty much just, well, I hope I face a Skarm and then I'll auto win, and if not, it's not really much of an exaggeration because those teams had so little to the point of not being non-existent in the way of offensive pressure, immediate offensive pressure. It was all very slow and gradual, and not in the way that was like Sand and Spikes. Because Sand and Spikes and Toxic and Will-O-Wisp and things, those add up very fast. I know going all in on Snorlax and Suicune, that's, you're not threatening until several boosts, and to be able to safely get those several boosts and be threatening, then that requires a lot of conditions beforehand, and it's very exploitable, very easy to get run over, and just get punished way too hard for not running into that matchup. So the idea with this team was to try and make a Magneton Claydol team that was more consistent. So rather than going in on something like Curse Rest Snorlax, I decided, okay, Suicune, good, because it's also a good defensive Pokemon. thanks to Stab Surf, whereas Curse Rest Snorlax, it's just going to make you terrible against special attackers of all sorts. You can't answer Moltres, and yeah, that was another thing. Like, if you want to run a Curse Rest Snorlax, and you also want to run Suicune alongside it, then you're very limited in dealing with things, even something as simple as a Moltres. So you're generally throwing on things like Milotic instead, and that's going to make you better against things like Mixments and Moltres, and then even worse against a lot of special attackers, like the Calm Minders. So rather than go with that, I decided, well, I don't like Curse Snorlax in general. I think it's too easy to stop, even with MagDal support. Like something as simple as a Metagross, it's like, oh, well, that's standing in my way. And then you can try and go Magneton and Dugtrio, but it's still very unreliable. And so I decided Suicune is both a good defensive Pokemon and a good offensive threat once it's supported. And instead, I'm going to use Blissey as the special wall. And rather than go all in on supporting it, I'm just going to have a set of good Pokemon, and that are also great beneficiaries of both Magneton and Spin. So Metagross is the very obvious candidate, because once you have Skarm out of the picture, Metagross is obviously a lot more threatening. And of course, you also have Choice Band Salamence. So even Metagross is not fast and immediately strong, whereas CB Mence is both. And CB Mence loves Magneton support, obviously. And Metagross and Blissey also love not having to deal with spikes. That's just like Suicune does. So that's the basic idea. And you've got good coverage against both offensive and defensive threats. Because Blissey stuffs everything specially. But it's not just about being passive and walling things with Blissey. It also gives it also is helped out by the physical onslaught of Metagross and Mence, and even Claydol, so you've got 2 explosions here, which is really nice. So you're able to force the issue against defense and have a backbone against offense. And mix and match against all sorts of teams. It's really helpful, especially because the Blissey has Wish, and that's really big. Because Suicune, as great as Rest Suicune is, sometimes the fact it only heals with Rest can really be a damper. It really can put a damper on your day. Rather, I mixed my expressions there. So being able to give it some passive recovery without that is just amazing. Blissey famously heals up Metagross as well. Snorlax comes in on Blissey. It's like, well, now here comes my Metagross switch, and you can Earthquake on the switch all you want, and Metagross just completely stuffs it. And, of course, CB Mence loves Blissey's Wish support. A fighting type comes in, and Mence just shrugs it off and gets wished. It's great. And makes up for Sand Chip as well. And then this team is overloaded with physical defense. You've not just in terms of EVs, but because pretty much the entire team checks physical attackers some way. You've obviously got your bold Suicune, but even Blissey is a good DD Mence check. And it can even take hits from Gyarados and Sand and whatnot. Metagross is obviously a great physical check. Mence helps with Intimidate, and the Salamence Metagross combo is famous for its physical checking abilities. You've got your Claydol, which also helps. I mean, that Quake Slide resistance. That's both Rock Slide and Earthquake combination, which is otherwise very difficult to resist. Only Breloom and Flygon match it in that regard. And even Magneton is great because it resists most choice banded attacks. Double Edges, Rock Slides, Hidden Power Flyings, Hidden Power Bugs, Meteor Mashes, of course. So yeah, pretty much the entire team is really good physically offensively, or physically defensively, while still hitting hard in return. It's not like you're just slapping, I don't know, Steelix, Dusclops, Haze, Weezing on a team and being like, I will never lose to Heracross, because that's not how that works. And whereas special offense, you've got, your one-stop shop in Blissey, of course, but you're not just going with the Blissey route, because you've also got a ton of pressure otherwise. You've got a Calm Mind Roar Suicune, you've got Metagross, which hits really hard, and CB Mence, of course, is famous for smacking around especially offensive Pokemon because they're not as physically bulky. You got your Boom with Claydol, which also has a nice set of resistances to use. Magneton, not so useful, but this is why I really like this team. Good against physical offense, good against special offense, good against various mixed stuff, as long as you play well. Obviously, it's not ironclad against everything. Nothing is. We'd be playing a very silly game if you could do that. But it's able to play around most things, pretty much everything well if you play well. I see a lot of people saying, it's like, oh, well, this team gets destroyed by so-and-so threat. And a lot of the time, it's like, not if you play halfway decently. I think that's a very paper Pokemon way of looking at it. Like, I'll see teams that have been beating so-and-so threat, like, let's say, I don't know, Moltres, for years. And someone who just started playing, 3 months ago comes and goes, I don't understand how this team was ever successful. It gets, ripped apart by Moltres. And then you go back and see, I don't know, like Asta, beating Moltres with this team like 16 times without breaking a sweat. And you're like, oh, well, it's because he has to play the game. A good advanced team is not about hard countering everything, because good luck with that. It's more about giving yourself the tools to be able to play the game and not just engage in paper matchups. So that's why I really like this team. It can, yeah, and I'll stop from repeating myself now. But I also love that it has this defensive backbone while still hitting really hard. And I didn't have a real reason for using it against Sadlicious. Sadlicious, I knew his playstyle. I knew he really liked spikes, and he liked various special offensive Pokemon. Like, he was a big fan of Rain a few years ago. But so I was like, yeah, this team is like a good choice. But more importantly, it's a team I'm really comfortable with, that I know how to use it, and it can adapt to all sorts of matchups. I'm not going fishing and going like, LOL, hope I don't face Aerodactyl, or something like that. So, yeah, I'm really, really happy with the team, and I was like, you know what, rather than overthink, my greatest weakness, and do something silly against a player as solid as Sadlicious, I'm just gonna go with something straightforward. I mean, obviously, before the game started, I was overthinking like crazy. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna bring 16 different teams, and they're all going to be unlike anything I've ever used before. And then I was like, oh wait, but these aren't as good. And then the ones that were good, I was like, oh, but I can't use this because I've used it before because it's good. And that stupid little loop until I decided, look, this is a good team, I like it, and yeah. So to the battle. Another nice thing about this team is that you can lead with a bunch of different stuff. Suicune was the original lead, but then I was like, I like leading with CB Ments. But this time around, I decided to lead Metagross because it didn't necessarily disguise the team, but it would make, sadly, a lot less likely to think MagDal than if I had led with Ments, because I led with Ments in the previous week, and it was a mixed set, but, a lot of the time, especially because I'm known for spamming CB Ments, and I'm always like, CB Ments needs Magneton, which it almost always does. I've come around on that. I built a couple teams before the season with Hariyama instead of Magneton, because I just love Hariyama. And in fact, I do have a version of this team now, a newer one, with Hariyama over Magneton. And then another version with Milotic over Suicune, and then another version with Jirachi over Metagross, stuff like that. It's great. So I love the flexibility that this kind of stuff offers. Anyway, so yeah, I decided, my first week I led off with Suicune, and that was a Magneton offense team. The second week I led off with Salamence, and that's and it wasn't a Magneton offense team, but if I lead off with Ments again, the alarm bells are already going off. Now, Metagross doesn't necessarily hide a Magneton, it's something you take into consideration, but it's also not a Pokemon I lead very often, so if he tries to do something funky, I'm gonna, he's not going to get what he expects, at the very least. And the nice thing about this team is like, yeah, okay, well, I didn't get a good lead matchup, whatever, fine. I can handle it. I also made some changes from the original team. The original team had Protect Metagross, and just because it's a good way to make the most out of Metagross' defensive capabilities, in this game, I used Rock Slide and a more offensive spread, simply because that whole thing I was going on about, how the team has, like, more physical defense than it can possibly do anything with. I was like, okay, I don't need to go fully defensive with Metagross. In fact, it would be better to have some more offense. And not just in terms of EVs, but in terms of moveset. And Rock Slide makes Metagross a lot harder to wall even after Skarma's gone down, because you are no longer terrified, or not terrified, you're no longer so walled by Zapdos, and you can't be walled by Moltres or Charizard, and that's really, really useful. Hell, it can even help against Gyarados without having to explode. So, yeah, I thought that was a good choice, especially if I'm going to lead with it, because if I lead with it, then and I have some special defense, then I can stay in and avoid a Zapdos 2-hit KO and Rock Slide it, and that will prevent any shenanigans with Zapdos baton passing to Blissey. Zapdos baton passing to Dugtrio against my Blissey and trapping it really early on. It's still a manageable matchup if that does happen, but you should try and keep that from happening if possible. So that's why I really liked Rock Slide Gross. Just make it more offensive, make it better on offense and defense, because it's not like this is a really frail team, which is really scraping for every bit of Metagross health it can get. So, with all that in mind, let's finally get to the lead matchup. Copenhagen Cowboy comes out again. Copenhagen Cowboy was wonderful. I loved it. Coming face to face with the T-Tar. I don't know what this T-Tar is, but no reason to mess around. I don't mind taking a big hit with Metagross because, first of all, it'll come with the benefit of slamming T-Tar, which is wonderful. Claydol really likes that, for example. I'm going to find out some information either way, because if it's a Pursuit Tar, then that's something Claydol has to keep in mind. It's an Adamant, or technically a Brave Claydol, that can 2-hit KO T-Tar, but it's still something you're wary of as an option, whereas non-Pursuit Tar is not going to be switching into Claydol like that. At least not in any way that's threatening. So, either I'm going to mash, and if I take damage, that's great. I can take any hit. I can take a Fire Blast, I can take a Choice Band EQ, and damaging T-Tar is really good. And, of course, thanks to support from Wish Blissey, I will be able to heal Metagross if I really need to. So, mash, but most of the time T-Tar isn't going to stay in here, and instead Fori comes in, and there's an attack boost, which, that was fortunate, but yeah, now Metagross is really threatening. And meta on Fori is always, kind of a toss-up. I was like, do I want to, what's it called? I go right to Magneton, because, he might EQ, but, in most cases, the Fortress user should not EQ, because then, assume the Metagross switches out, and, switches to, Salamence or Charizard or something, and you passed up a chance to get spikes. It's like, that's not good. So EQ, and I was also getting paranoid of something like counter, but that would really be unlikely to see here. If counter is getting used, it's after the initial hit. It's not right away. So spike very likely. So I was thinking I could go to Magneton, get the trap off, all that stuff, but I was also like, if I weaken the Fori, then I can also force in another Pokemon and do a lot of damage. And, my team's got a good backbone. It's got sustainability. It doesn't need to rush to get Fori out of the way. So I figured I'm going to stay in and hit him with the +1 EQ. And then, I assume it's going to be a spike. But then I had an idea that was brewing in my head. Because I was, first of all, that EQ does a lot of damage. And this is when I was really thanking myself for investing in attack on this thing. But I was also... I had this idea in my head that I wanted to use Rock Slide. One reason initially was, okay, there's a chance that counter comes in. Because Rock Slide will 2-hit KO Fori if it stays in. And if that is the case, then there's not really a meaningful difference between that and EQ. And it can also flinch, which is great. And the flinch rate was why I was thinking, in case of counter, you might stay in and use it, but it's also it might get foiled because of that flinch chance, which would make EQ better. But as I was thinking about it, beyond just Rock Slide, I was also thinking about, okay, well, what are the other Pokemon? Because we wanted information, right? Like, just if the T-Tar stays in and does a lot of damage, then that's information beyond just damage. So T-Tar, Fori, you're gonna have your physical wall, Rock Answer, usually Swampert on Fori teams, because things like Metagross are defensively redundant. You start really struggling to deal with fire moves and earthquakes and such. And you wouldn't use Flygon because it's going to be... you wouldn't use Flygon because it's Spike's immune. And if you're going to use a Spike's immune physical wall, then you would just use Skarmory as your spiker instead. Fori, Flygon, it tends to be counterintuitive. I'm not saying it's a hard rule, but there is a good reason why pretty much all Fortress teams use Swampert. Claydol is also an option, right? Because some teams like Fori and Claydol to make it easier to spin, so you're not putting all the burden on Fortress. But if that is the case, Claydol is not a Metagross switch-in. And that would lead you to running another Pokemon like Zapdos, or sometimes people go with Jirachi as their de facto physical check alongside Claydol, which works, but still not really a Metagross answer, especially at +1 attack. So I was thinking it's usually going to be Swampert here, but you don't want to switch Swampert into +1 EQ early in the game. I've already chunked Fori for half its health. The meta is at +1 attack, and it has taken no damage. Switching right to Swampert to take it out, to take a +1 EQ like that, it's getting battered down really early in the game, really fast, and that would be fantastic. I would then my Salamence is just going to go absolutely crazy, to say nothing of Metagross itself. And also, Swampert's not really a threat at all, so I don't mind that. And then I got to thinking, okay, well, EQ will also hit Swampert really hard. And then I got to thinking, well, Swampert doesn't really want to switch into that +1 EQ. It's, with already having taken so much damage, and the Metagross not having taken anything in return. Like, yeah, Spike. Okay, that's great for later. And then I was thinking about how these kinds of teams love to use Moltres or Charizard, specifically because, and it's also on Skarmory teams as well, but especially with Fortress, because Fortress can't phase Metagross out, and you can't always fit the moves to actually do something to Metagross with. And the moves you actually do something to Metagross with don't actually hit it that hard, bar counter, which, really rare. Yeah, so like EQ, not exactly threatening Metagross too much. Right? So, and that's why these teams like to run Moltres, Charizard, and sometimes Zapdos to a similar extent. It's not as ironclad because it doesn't instantly threaten Metagross as much with an Oko, but it's still very common, and obviously Zapdos is an amazing Pokemon. So, but the reason they like Moltres and Charizard is the biggest problem with these T-Tar, with these Pursuit Tar, which is what I'm assuming it is, Pursuit Tar to help Fori spin. Pursuit Tar, Fori, Swampert, and then, you throw in your other things. You throw in your Blissies, your Gengars, your whatever your filler is, Dugtrio, Arrow, stuff like that. They tend to, you'd have to make room for, a lot of times Gengar gets dropped for such threats. But they tend to risk falling behind against really aggressive teams, right? Because they're, Fori's a good defensive Pokemon, but it more thrives in slower games. Whereas against offense, you're kind of looking for that spike and you got to get out of there. And when you have that dynamic, when you got to get out of there and you're facing down a big threat like a Metagross, then you need something to instantly threaten it. You need something to instantly level out the playing field more. You need to... Yeah, I'm just trying to really hammer the point home that when you have a team that's on the slower side, you then need to be able to threaten instant big damage. A Salamence or a mixed Salamence is another great example for such a Pokemon. Not so much in terms of defensively switching into Metagross, but in terms of immediate, super effective, big damage, threatening Okos or close to it, especially with Spike support. Then you need that Pokemon that's going to... Not need, but you very much like that Pokemon that's going to, switch in and instantly wrest momentum back. Let's rest with the W, not, rest as in go to sleep. You need that Pokemon that instantly switch and get momentum back. And that's why Charizard and Moltres are so popular on these kinds of teams, because they're the only Pokemon that switch into Metagross and threaten it out instantly. So, and they're obviously amazing Spikes abusers as well, but that's their defensive niche. They're not just good offensively. They're, switching in to Metagross is their greatest offensive, or their greatest defensive trait. So I was thinking, if there is a fire, this team is not really afraid of those fires. I've got a Suicune and a Blissey and, Claydol and a Salamence. At the same time, it would be game-changing if they put it this way: if they come in, they're coming in right now, right? Charizard and Moltres. And if Swampert comes in, I'll be like, oh man, I could have hit that with a +1 EQ, but Swampert is much less threatening because it's not that the team in a nutshell is threatened by Charizard and Moltres. It's that with that sand and one spike up, that it could potentially start doing irritating things. Moltres can start roaring Metagross in, and then spreading chip damage, and Charizard can do silly things with like beat up, and Suicune is like fine as well, but it can get forced to rest very quickly, and then I might start falling behind, and basically. It's not that I'm threatened by them, but I am more threatened by them than Swampert by a long shot. If Swampert comes in, I'm like, all right, standard Fori stuff, I'll be fine. I'm going to take the Fori out eventually and spin with Claydol and then Suicune. And there's not going to be a ton of offensive pressure, and Suicune will be fine, and I'll beat it down with Salamence and keep healthy with Blissey. Basically, the plan for this team. But if Moltres and Charizard or Charizard come in, that can potentially be irritating and make me lose some momentum, and then I'll have to fight to get it back. Right now, I'm really in the driver's seat, and if my Pokemon idol Goki, he used to use this term a lot. He used to say, even when you're ahead, it's easy to just go on cruise control and say, oh, I'm fine, I'm doing okay, and what you really want to do, what great players really do, that you want to step on your opponent's throat. If you read how they're going to try and respond to you and try to bring the game back into their favor, and you stifle that, they're dead. And that's one of the differences between just good players and like great players. And I took that to heart. And so this is me saying, okay, if I don't Rock Slide a Moltres or Charizard, who cares? Because they're more threatening than whatever else would come in. Swampert comes in, yeah, Swampert to this team, yeah, real threatening. So I'm fine with that. But if I manage to hit a Moltres or Charizard on the switch, because there's no way it would be expected. Rock Slide on Metagross is, even 4 attacks. It's more expected on Agility, but you're not going to be leading off with Agility Metagross almost ever. And 4 attacks is very rare, and for it to even get used here is very unlikely. So, all in all, I say all that to say I'm going to Rock Slide here to hit Moltres or Charizard, or Zapdos, also very possible. And if Swampert comes in, then I know that team is not going to be threatening me as much as it otherwise could have. So, yeah, Molt and Moltzard are such staples on such teams for good reasons. Spikes abusers and checking Metagross, and this is what really drove it home. As I was thinking about it more and more, and I was thinking, it's like, how would someone counter team BKC? I'm not saying counter team as in like, throw the game to the matchup gods and pray. I mean, like, what would someone like to use to get an advantage over stuff I usually like to use? And be like, you know what, Moltres and Charizard tend to be annoying with sand and spikes. Not because they're annoying to everyone, obviously, but I don't use Pokemon like Milotic very much, so they're a lot more irritating than someone who would use Milotic, for example. So and then that really cemented it, that like, yeah, okay, especially Charizard, because I use a lot of Blissey, and Charizard can beat up Blissey very efficiently. That's what helped rise it to OU officially. I have to make a video on that. So, yeah, Zar, I thought, yeah, that really, really seals it. It's going to be very likely it comes in. So I go for Rock Slide. In comes Charizard, and I don't miss, and I feel very grateful that I got that mash boost, first of all, because that allowed for this situation. I mean, theoretically, if I didn't get the mash boost on the first turn, I could have gone for it again, or I could have EQ'd and stuff like that. But, yeah, always got to be cognizant of the odds in Pokemon. So, that felt really... after that turn, I was like, you know what, I could lose... Well, actually, if I lose this game, then that would probably be either sadly just, went full-on God mode, or I just spectacularly choked, or a combination of both. But, the rest of the season doesn't matter. That felt really good, to catch an unrevealed Charizard like that with Rock Slide. Then, yeah, because if you're just autopiloting, then that will never happen. So I was really happy about that. So huge advantage for me right now. And now in comes a Swampert. And obviously I was tempted to blow it up right away. I was like, oh man, 6-5 and the Fori's at half health, and then, Salamence will destroy. But just like in the previous week where I had the opportunity to boom with Claydol, I was like, I'm in no rush to do that. This is not a super fast-paced offensive team. So I go to, and it protects anyway, so, playing EQ versus boom games this early on, no need. So I go to Suicune, just because it stuffs Swampert, and I just throw out a Surf. Or no, I don't throw out a Surf. I thought I would. I think I should have thrown out a Surf just to see what's going out there. Because even if I hit like a Blissey or a Celebi, then I chunk it for a little bit of health in Sand, and that's why Sand is so powerful. Because even like a little Surf will then be significant for a roll later on potentially. So Celebi comes in, and I was thinking there's a lot of things Celebi can do. It's one of the reasons why it's so good. And I arguably could have stayed in and just seen what set it was. I was thinking it was Leech 3 attacks. And, also, the last is... I was thinking Gengar still at this point. Yeah, so I was thinking I could have stayed in and roared and just, gotten more information. Because nothing else is really going to be threatening. I'm going to roar in either Swampert or Fori or T-Tar. Or the last. I would love to have that information. So I should have stayed in and roared. Yeah, but I was thinking it's like Leech 3 attack with something like Charizard just to pile on the offensive pressure. Instead, Calm Mind shows up. I'm like, okay, yeah, so I definitely could have Calm Minded. But the fact that it's Calm Mind and not Leech Seed, because I think if it's Calm Mind Leech is coming out first, then that means that Suicune could potentially beat it later on with Roar. So that's significant information. Still should have roared. I just didn't want to, get roared and Leech Seed again. But then again, if I, roar into... that was a little short-sighted of me, because if I roar and bring in Fori, then it's not going to stay in, or Swampert or whatever, it's not going to stay in, and then I can double switch to Claydol as Celebi comes in. And Calm Mind is the more threatening option, and just switching to Claydol on Calm Mind is a lot more threatening than, Suicune getting leeched and then forced into resting. So... that was short-sighted of me, but I go to Claydol either way, because even though it's not as good a move I could have made, it's still fine. So I spin, because I can take +2 Giga Drain, and if I just take 1, then I'm fine. Still not threatening. I still have full health Metagross, which takes +2 HP Fires. I have CB Ments, and I have a Blissey. So, and a Roar Suicune if worst comes to worst. So then I stay in and just go for Boom on the second Calm Mind, and sadly reveals that it's not a Gengar, thankfully, and it's more of a Jirachi, which makes a lot more sense, because Gengar is a cool Calm Mind Pass recipient, but it's not very common to see it. So, and Jirachi helps both offensively and defensively with its typing, whereas you've got Charizard kind of occupying the Gengar slot. So, I blow up and don't hit, I don't get a KO for it, but taking out half of Jirachi's health is still really great. That's still absolutely wonderful. So I've removed Spike Pressure and chunked Jirachi for half its health. You know what? Fine. I'll take it. Hey, and I chunked Celebi for 4% with Rapid Spin. That's significant. See, that sticks with Sand. So if Fori gets spikes up again, I'm not going to be able to spin it, but that's fine because Jirachi being brought down to 56 after lefties is still really, really good. That makes CB Ments even scarier, makes Suicune scarier, and I now know all Pokemon on the opposing team. So Calm Mind Roar Suicune is really, really good here. So I go to Metagross because it lives +2 Fire Punch, and I EQ, and in comes Swampert, and now I see why that Swampert was really reluctant to switch in, because it's not even a defensive, it's got bulk obviously, but it's not even like a classic defensive Swampert. It's an offensive variant. So now I see his approach. He's got the spikes and the Fori, but the rest of his team is very offensive. He's got the Charizard, obviously, an offensive Swampert, and the Zard and the Pert and the Jirachi are all supported further by Calm Mind passing Celebi, and it's really, really unexpected, because when you see Fori, you don't think... you think offensive options, like Charizard, of course. That's the whole reason the Rock Slide move was clicked. But you're also thinking, yeah, but there's also going to be like a Blissey and stuff. So, yeah, so now I really see why that Swampert was it was even more reluctant to switch into the +1 EQ than before, because it would have gotten 2 KO'd. So, or very close to it. So in comes Suicune again to avoid EQ, or not to avoid EQ, but to take pittance from EQ. And here I go for Calm Mind as opposed to Surf. I think, Surf chunking Celebi would have been fine, because then I can go to Salamence and start putting on some pressure. But Calm Mind, I started thinking, yeah, now I can get something going with Suicune. I definitely messed this up a little, though. I should have... That Surf was, not bad, but it's also not as good a move as I could have made. So I should have Calm Minded again, because if Swampert comes in, who cares? Or stays in, who cares? First of all, he's not going to risk it. That's another thing. Offensive Swampert, just staying in and taking that one surf, risking that one surf was, something. He's trying to get Suicune to rest, of course. But the idea is with Calm Mind Rest, then nothing he's going to throw at me is going to be too threatening if I get that second Calm Mind. I mean, even with the one Calm Mind, he's not threatening to break through me immediately because Suicune is insanely bulky, and as soon as it wakes up, it roars out any attempts at Calm Mind boosting. That's why it's so scary. But with a second boost, then it's just lights out. So I should have gone for that second boost as opposed to trying to punish the Swampert for staying in and force me to rest. So again, a little short-sighted, a little out of practice with the mechanics of using Calm Mind Rest Suicune. It's not the most intuitive Pokemon, so... now in comes Calm Mind again, and I believe I go for Roar, just to not let it get anything going. Yeah, and I Roar in T-Tar. So I'm still thinking Pursuit Tar, and I go for a second Calm Mind, like I should have before, to force the issue with Celebi coming back in, because I assume it's going to come back in, Giga Drain, and then try and get something going. I assume Pursuit Tar not threatening me at all. And it DDs instead, and I was like, oh, that's extremely unexpected. Because with Fori, then you generally run Pursuit Tar, so that means that the Fori is a HP Ghost, almost surely. He wouldn't fish no Gengar. I use plenty of Spikes Gengar, like everyone. And it's a very silly thing to fish for in general. But I really like that. That makes his team even more aggressively offensive. The Fori is kind of a fake out, because you've got this Calm Mind Pass stuff, but when you see Fori, you kind of turn your brain off to, oh, the Celebi will Calm Mind Pass. And you definitely turn off to the idea of DD Tar. So... But it's still fine, because Bold Suicune is practically immortal, and if it's an offensive DD Tar, it will almost surely get, destroyed by +2 Surf, and even a bulky DD Tar, well, it hits, even less hard, and so it might take a +2 Surf, but it'll still be manageable afterwards, and then I'll chunk the Tar, and then I'll, get health back later with Rest, Wish, whatever, and I'll be fine, because I will have removed, or significantly chunked another threat. So but I think with the fast pace of his team, then I think an offensive Tar is more likely. It goes more well with the Zard, Sella, Rachi thing, the offensive variants of Sella and Rachi, as opposed to a bulky DD Tar, because the team wants to play at a fast pace. So you want your speed and your Lumberry as opposed to a bulky or lefties DD Tar that really prefers longer, slower games for more precise setup. No, you want to be as instantly dangerous as possible. So that's what I'm thinking anyway. So that means +2 Surf is was still a fine move. Before we get into that turn, then I was also, after I was thinking, should I have Surf? And then I was like, no, because your methods for hitting an offensive DD Tar are not going to change. It's going to be like Mence, EQ, and Metagross. It's not going to be that much of a difference. Sure, yes, it would have helped, because it would now be in range for something like Blissey Seismic Toss. But if Celebi comes in on the +1 Surf, then you're more or less in the same situation you were before. And you want to Calm Mind there. So, I think Calm Minding there was fine. But the real move to make was Calm Minding earlier, again, on turn 12, when Celebi switched and took the Surf. Instead, it should have been Calm Minding on Calm Minding on that turn instead of Surfing. Also notable is that the +1 Surf did only 18 to Celebi. Now, I know it's a bulky Suicune, and Celebi is naturally bulky, but at the same time, that shows signs of a very bulky Celebi, and that's significant because it's either not hitting that hard or it's not that fast. Both can be relevant. So yeah, Calm Mind again, and T-Tar DDs. And then Rock Slide and Flinch, and Suicune is now in Spike's range. That's significant. And I was like, ugh, that's pain. So, Yeah, but the good news is I know he's EQing. You're not risking a Rock Slide miss on a 12% Suicune. So I go to Salamence for the Intimidate, and he EQs. And I was really happy with that move. Because like you'll see that sometimes that a really good player will switch in, like in like when you know a good player is not going to risk finishing you off from low health with Focus Blast, so they'll switch in a Focus Blast weak Pokemon because they know you're not going to go for it. So even if it's a neutral move, so something like that. Like you see that a lot in like Gen 7, for example. It's like yeah, you've got like a Tapu Lele or a Mega Zam trying to finish off something that's at low health. And so let's say like a 10% Magearna, right? And you know they're not going to finish it off with a Focus Blast. So that lets you, even though Focus Blast is neutral on it, so that lets you switch into something like Heatran, and then you switch on a Psychic or a Shadow Ball, and then you're able to take the follow-up Focus Blast, even though Focus Blast could have been used there. Or you know, even better, you could have it aimed at like a Pokemon weak to it, you know, rather than Magearna. Anyway, you get the idea. Even though Rock Slide is neutral on Suicune there, you're not going to risk it to finish it off, and that lets Mens come in and cut the T-Tar down to that. And now I'm going to double switch to Metagross, to try and catch the 4E switch. That was a great move on Sadly's end, because he knows I'm almost surely going to go to Metagross or Suicune, but rather than risk the Rock Slide EQ game, he decides, you know what, I'm going to go to 4E and get my Spike up, and that's going to be really helpful. So especially now that Claydol is gone, so I go to Magneton now that Spike's definitely coming, and Spike will be obnoxious, but I am now up 5-4, so I get a Pokemon for it at least. So, also significant is that I can actually use the Spike to my advantage. Suicune is in Spike range, and the turn ends in advance when a Pokemon faints, so if I switch in and it's KO'd by Spikes, then that means I can delay a crucial setup turn, and that's really big. So in comes T-Tar, I just go right for a T-Bolt, and also it shows that this is a modest Magneton, so that is definitely an adamant T-Tar. But it DDs again, and doesn't show lefties, so it is Lum, and so maybe the +2 serve didn't kill, depending on the bulk, because it's a modest Magneton, so that T-Bolt really stings. I don't know, that's really just details. So I decide, if he just KOs me with Earthquake, that's fine. I'll have prevented the DD, and then I can go to my CB Ments and probably pick or come close to KOing something with EQ, because T-Tar slammed, Jirachi slammed, Swampert slammed, and Celebi switching into Salamence is a risky proposition. And yeah, so I figured it was worthwhile. Plus, the likelihood that he DDs is quite high. Yeah, it is quite high, and you can, and that can be punished. So now, he's definitely in range for Metagross EQ. I don't even have to Meteor Mash it anymore. Because he doesn't want to just EQ into Ments, for example. Speaking of EQing into Ments, I thought, look, am I going to do the Ments thing again? And I do. Oh my god, I thought I just sacked Suicune right away. Wow. Myself from a month ago had a better train of thought than myself right now. Good job, me. Yeah, so Ments comes in again, intimidates it. And now I know I sacked Suicune, because I was like, I can go to Metagross again, but no reason to get fancy and risk him DDing again or EQing or anything silly. Look, just this is basically sacrificing Suicune for that half health you got on T-Tar. That's really big. And now I'm able to go to Metagross and take a neutral EQ, not +1, really easily, and then threaten something else. I want to preserve Metagross's health so that I can, I don't want to risk it needlessly. So I think that was a good use of the sacrifice, because I don't need to cut off like Celebi Calm Minding at all costs. I've got Ments. So EQ, finish it off, and the +1 or the neutral EQ does a lot, but I'm still out of range for both Fire Punch from Jirachi and HP Fire from Celebi. Now Celebi comes in, and I figured, all right, I'm just gonna simplify things. No need to let this get silly. I think it's fairly clear that the Celebi is going to try and bait my explosion and then switch to either Swampert or Jirachi. First of all, the fact I have Blissey waiting in the back is really great. That's just amazing. And so no matter what. But Explosion also takes out another Pokemon. I have a nice 2-for-1 with Metagross here and simplifies the game. Because if Jirachi goes down, then Salamence clicks HP Flying easily. And if Swampert goes down, then Blissey is just going to sit on both. Not to mention that Salamence remains a threat. So I just go for Explosion, and he sacks Jirachi, and down it goes. So I believe I went to Magneton on the double. No, I go right to Blissey. Good move for me. Yeah, no need to sacrifice Magneton yet, because I can just go right for Seismic Toss and start wearing the Swampert down, because I don't need to preserve Blissey's health at all costs. I mean, I want to beat it one-on-one, but the fact is that it's not going to have a Focus Punch on that set, which is really good, so Blissey will beat it one-on-one. And as soon as I knock into certain range, then I'm starting to threaten an HP Flying Sweep. Because you saw how much that unboosted EQ did from Metagross. That did 36. So, a Choice Banded HP Flying from Mets is going to absolutely slam it. So just go right for Seismic Toss. Celebi comes in. It's not going to be threatening Salamence with anything serious. So I just go right to Ments. No need to... he's going to I'm forcing him to make the plays. Like, he would have to, like, switch to Swampert again, and then, I mean, yeah, Swampert would be in a decent position there, but at the same time, Celebi would have taken damage, and so at that point, I'm closer to winning with Blissey, because the threat, if there is any, is Celebi Calm Minding and doing something stupid, and even that's not much of a threat. It's pretty much just being as safe as possible with Blissey. So now Mence comes in on a Calm Mind to try and get something going. Mence is faster, even though I'm adamant. And I just go for CBHP Flying, because either Swampert comes in and gets slammed and I win, or Celebi dies and I'm that much closer to a win. So now the move is pretty much to just sacrifice Magneton. I mean, if I can get a Toxic on it, that's great, but he makes the great move and EQs to hit Blissey, more notably, but... that's why Magneton was sacked. Now I go to Mence to get an to get an Intimidate off on the Swampert, and now I go back to Blissey, and it's now EQ is even less threatening than it already is because it's at -1, and one crit is not necessarily enough, or one freeze. And I also decided to even out the odds. Rather than Seismic Tossing, I'm going to go with my own Ice Beam. It's also an offensive Swampert, so it might be -SpDef, so Ice Beam might actually chunk it pretty hard. But Ice Beam can also freeze. It can also... And a crit Ice Beam from me is a lot more significant than a crit Ice Beam from him. And even if he gets one EQ crit, depending on what it is, it might not necessarily be enough. I mean, obviously there's an element of luck to it. But hey, I can also crit the HP Flying, so... yeah, because if he gets one freeze, I can switch to Mence and then try it again. If he crits one EQ, then it's going to do like 70, I think. And then he has to still crit the next or freeze on the next turn or something. So one turn of bad luck is not necessarily going to do it. And I'm adding my own possibilities for luck into the equation by spamming Ice Beam. So now that he's this low, though, I'm just going for Protect. He's not using Protect too freely because he doesn't want to give me a free Soft Boiled. Yeah, and here I use Seismic Toss just to, guarantee, just in case it, I don't know. At this point, I was like, just safe damage, fine. Ice Beam was probably okay, but I didn't want to risk a low roll, and Seismic Toss is pretty consistently going to do in that 25 range, depending on how much HP he has. So Seismic Toss him down, and at this point, I'm just gonna keep attacking, and because he's at low range for Mence, and Blissey winds up just winning again. So that was a great game too, sadly. I love that team. I think it's so cool. The fake out with the Fori and then just the bombardment of offensive pressure. I think it's amazing. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Note that All That Jazz, the Salamence, is just the greatest thing ever. And I will catch you in the next one.